Welcome back to my channel. Hope Logan stood at the center of a storm she never intended to create, yet somehow always seemed destined to face. After being pushed out of Forrester Creations in a move that still felt both shocking and deeply personal, she refused to let her identity be defined by rejection. Instead, she turned that pain into purpose, channeling every ounce of heartbreak, anger, and determination into building something entirely her own. Logan, a fashion house rooted not just in style, but in independence, resilience, and truth. What began as a quiet idea whispered between Hope and her mother soon became a bold declaration to the entire fashion world. She was done living in anyone else's shadow. And as word spread about her new venture, it didn't take long for others, disillusioned, loyal, or simply inspired, to make a choice that would send shockwaves through Los Angeles. For people, each with their own complicated history, would step away from everything they knew to follow Hope into the unknown. The first was Carter Walton, a man who had long served as the moral compass within Forrester Creations, but who had increasingly found himself torn between loyalty and integrity. Carter had watched Hope's dismissal unfold with growing discomfort, knowing deep down that the decision had been less about business and more about personal grudges and unchecked power. For weeks, he tried to convince himself that staying was the responsible thing to do, that he could influence change from within, but every boardroom meeting, every forced justification only made it clearer. The company he believed in was no longer the company he worked for. When Hope approached him, not with desperation but with quiet confidence, he saw something he hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. Joining Logan wasn't just about supporting Hope. It was about reclaiming his own sense of purpose. His departure sent immediate ripples through the corporate structure, leaving those at Forrester scrambling to understand how they had lost one of their most trusted leaders. Next came Katie Logan, whose decision surprised almost no one, and yet still managed to carry immense emotional weight. Katie had always been fiercely protective of her sisters, but her loyalty had often been tested by the complicated dynamics between business and family. This time, however, there was no hesitation. Watching Hope be cast aside had reignited something in Katie, a reminder of every time the Logan women had been underestimated, dismissed, or treated as expendable. She refused to let history repeat itself. More than that, she believed in Hope's vision. Katie saw Logan not just as a company but as a movement, one that could redefine what power looked like in their world. Bringing her media expertise and sharp instincts with her, Katie became an immediate force within the new venture, determined to ensure that Hope's voice would not only be heard, but amplified. The third to make the leap was a decision that stunned nearly everyone: Zen Forrester Dominguez. As a member of the Forrester family, Zen's allegiance had always seemed unquestionable, but beneath the surface, he had been grappling with his own frustrations. As a designer, he felt stifled, his creativity often overshadowed by legacy expectations and internal politics. He admired Hope's willingness to take a risk, to build something from the ground up, rather than rely on a name. When he approached her, it wasn't out of rebellion but out of respect, for her vision, her courage, and the opportunity to finally express himself freely. His departure marked a turning point, signaling that Logan was not just a refuge for the wronged, but a legitimate competitor capable of attracting top talent from even the most established houses. Finally, there was Daphne Rose, whose journey to Logan was perhaps the most unexpected of all. Daphne had always walked a fine line between ambition and self-preservation, aligning herself where she believed the power lay. But recent events had forced her to reconsider what power truly meant. Watching Hope rebuild herself from nothing, refusing to be broken, struck a chord deep within her. Daphne realized that she had spent too long chasing security at the cost of authenticity. Joining Logan was a risk, one that could either elevate her career or destroy it, but for the first time she was willing to take that chance. Her arrival added a layer of complexity to the team, as not everyone fully trusted her intentions, yet Hope welcomed her with cautious optimism, believing that people deserved the opportunity to prove themselves. Together, these four individuals formed the foundation of something extraordinary. Logan was no longer just an idea. It was a force, driven by a shared belief in second chances and bold beginnings. The chemistry among them was undeniable, a blend of experience, creativity, and determination that quickly translated into momentum. Their first collection, developed under intense pressure and limited resources, carried an energy that set it apart from anything on the market. It wasn't just fashion, it was a statement, a reflection of everything they had endured and everything they refused to accept any longer. Meanwhile, across town, the impact of their departures was being felt with increasing urgency. Forrester Creations found itself facing an internal crisis unlike any it had encountered before. The loss of Carter disrupted the company's legal and executive stability, while Zen's exit created a noticeable void in the design team. Katie's shift to Logan meant that media narratives were no longer in their control, and Daphne's departure raised uncomfortable questions about loyalty and leadership. Tensions escalated as blame was quietly passed from one executive to another, each trying to maintain a sense of authority in a situation that was rapidly slipping beyond their grasp. At the center of it all, Hope remained focused. She knew that success wouldn't come overnight, that there would be setbacks, doubts, and moments where the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm her. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. For the first time in a long time, she was surrounded by people who believed in her, not because of her last name but because of who she was and what she stood for. That realization gave her strength, grounding her even as the stakes continued to rise. As Logan prepared to officially launch, anticipation built throughout the fashion world. Critics speculated, competitors watched closely, and supporters rallied behind the brand's message. It was more than just a debut. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to prove that walking away from something familiar could lead to something far greater. For Hope and those who had chosen to follow her, there was no turning back. They had taken the leap, embraced the uncertainty, and committed themselves to a future that was entirely their own. And as the lights dimmed and the first model stepped onto the runway, carrying with her the essence of everything Logan represented, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The applause that followed the final walk at Logan's debut show did not feel polite or obligatory. It felt earned, raw, and almost defiant, as though everyone in the room understood they had just witnessed something far more significant than a fashion launch. Hope Logan stood just beyond the curtain, her hands trembling slightly as she took in the reaction, her eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces, for signs that this risk, this enormous, terrifying leap, had been worth it. And in that moment, as Carter Walton stepped beside her with a quiet nod of approval, as Katie Logan squeezed her hand with pride, as Zen Forrester Dominguez exhaled the tension he'd been carrying for weeks, and even as Daphne Rose allowed herself a rare, genuine smile, Hope realized that Logan was no longer just an idea fighting to survive. It was a reality demanding to be reckoned with. But success, especially in Los Angeles and especially in the world they inhabited, never came without consequences. Back at Forrester Creations, the reaction to Logan's debut was swift and deeply divided. Some dismissed it publicly, calling it a fleeting spectacle fueled by controversy rather than substance, but behind closed doors, the tone was far more serious. Executives who had once laughed off Hope's departure were now asking uncomfortable questions, reviewing projections, and trying to assess just how much damage had already been done. The absence of Carter Walton was being felt in every legal discussion, every contract negotiation that suddenly seemed more complicated without his steady guidance. Zen's creative fingerprints were missing from the latest designs, leaving a subtle but undeniable gap that even the most loyal team members couldn't ignore. And perhaps most frustrating of all, Katie Logan's presence at Logan meant that the narrative, the story being told to the public, was no longer theirs to control. Steffi Forrester, in particular, found herself caught between defiance and doubt. She had believed with absolute certainty that removing Hope from the company was the right decision, that it would strengthen Forrester, eliminate distractions, and reinforce the authority she had worked so hard to maintain. But now, as headlines began to shift and whispers of Logan's success grew louder, she was forced to confront a possibility she had refused to consider. What if she had underestimated Hope? What if, in trying to assert control, she had inadvertently created her strongest competitor? It was a thought she pushed away repeatedly, yet it lingered, resurfacing in quiet moments when she found herself alone with the consequences of her choices. Meanwhile, at Logan, the momentum was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Orders began to come in faster than anyone had anticipated, interest from buyers and investors growing by the hour. Katie worked tirelessly to manage the influx of media attention, carefully shaping the narrative to highlight not just the drama that had led to Logan's creation, but the vision and values that set it apart. She knew that sustaining success would require more than a compelling story. It would require consistency, credibility, and a clear identity that resonated beyond the initial buzz. Carter, ever the strategist, focused on building a solid foundation beneath the excitement. He reviewed contracts, negotiated partnerships, and ensured that every step forward was supported by careful planning, rather than impulsive decisions. He understood better than anyone that rapid growth could be as dangerous as failure if not managed properly, and he was determined to protect Logan from the kind of instability that had plagued other ambitious startups. His presence brought a sense of order to the chaos, allowing the rest of the team to focus on their strengths without losing sight of the bigger picture. Zend, energized by the freedom he had long craved, threw himself into his work with renewed passion. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened by expectations tied to his last name, able to explore ideas that had once been dismissed or reshaped to fit someone else's vision. His designs became bolder, more personal, reflecting not just his talent but his journey, a journey that now intertwined with hopes in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Their creative collaboration became one of Logan's greatest strengths, a dynamic partnership that pushed both of them to take risks and redefine what they were capable of achieving. And then there was Daphne Rose, whose role within Logan continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Initially viewed with caution, even skepticism, she began to prove herself not through words but through action. Her instincts, once used primarily for self-advancement, were now directed toward the success of the team as a whole. She identified opportunities others might have missed, navigated challenges with a sharp, calculated approach, and gradually earned a level of trust that had once seemed out of reach. Still, there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when her past alliances cast a shadow over her present intentions, reminding everyone that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. As the weeks passed, the contrast between Logan and Forrester Creations became increasingly apparent. Where Forrester struggled with internal tensions and shifting dynamics, Logan thrived on collaboration and shared purpose. Where Forrester relied on legacy and established reputation, Logan embraced innovation and authenticity. It wasn't just a business rivalry. It was a clash of philosophies, a reflection of deeper questions about power, identity, and what it truly meant to succeed. For Hope Logan, however, the journey was far from over. If anything, the initial success only raised the stakes, bringing new challenges and pressures that tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. There were nights when doubt crept in, when the weight of responsibility felt almost too heavy to carry, when she questioned whether she had made the right choices, not just for herself, but for everyone who had chosen to follow her. In those moments, she found strength in the very people who had taken that leap with her, in the shared belief that had brought them together and continued to push them forward. Because in the end, Logan was never just about proving others wrong. It was about proving something to themselves, that they were capable of more, that they could rise above circumstances that once defined them, that they could build something meaningful out of uncertainty and risk. And as they stood on the edge of whatever came next, one thing was certain. The story of Logan and of the 4 people who had chosen to follow Hope was only just beginning to unfold, with twists and turns that would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, ambition, and the price of chasing a dream. The days following Logan's explosive debut began to take on a rhythm that was both exhilarating and unforgiving, as if success itself had a pulse that refused to slow down. Hope Logan quickly realized that launching the company had been the easy part compared to sustaining it. Every decision now carried weight, financial, emotional, and deeply personal, and every success seemed to invite an equal and opposite challenge. Still, she refused to let the pressure fracture what they had built. Instead, she leaned into it, determined to prove that Logan was not a fleeting rebellion but a lasting force. The first real test came sooner than expected. A major international buyer, one that could elevate Logan from a promising newcomer to a global contender, expressed interest, but with conditions. They wanted exclusivity, control over distribution, and subtle influence over design direction. It was the kind of deal that could secure Logan's financial future overnight, eliminating many of the risks that still loomed over the company. But it also threatened to compromise the very identity Hope had fought to create. The team gathered late into the night, the atmosphere tense as each of them weighed the implications. Carter Walton approached it from a legal and structural standpoint, outlining both the benefits and the potential long-term consequences. He made it clear that while the deal could provide stability, it could also create dependencies that would be difficult to break. Katie Logan, ever attuned to perception, warned that accepting such terms might undermine the authenticity that had become Logan's greatest strength. Zen Forrester Dominguez struggled with the idea of creative limitations, the thought of once again having his designs shaped by external demands stirring memories of why he had left Forrester in the first place. And Daphne Rose, perhaps surprisingly, took a more nuanced stance, acknowledging the risks but also recognizing the opportunity to strategically negotiate terms that could benefit them without sacrificing control. All eyes eventually turned to Hope. It was her vision, her company, her call. And in that moment, she understood that leadership was not about avoiding difficult choices, but about making them with clarity and conviction. After a long silence, she declined the offer. It wasn't a decision made lightly, nor was it one that came without fear. But she knew that compromising now would set a precedent that could unravel everything they stood for. The relief in the room was palpable, though it was quickly followed by the sobering realization that they had just walked away from a safety net they might not see again. That decision, however, had an unexpected effect. Word spread, not just that Logan had been offered a major deal, but that they had turned it down. In an industry often driven by profit above all else, the move was seen as bold, even radical. It reinforced the idea that Logan was different, that it operated on principles rather than convenience. And for many that made it even more appealing. But not everyone viewed it as admirable. At Forrester Creations, the narrative was being shaped very differently. Steffi Forrester, determined to regain control of the situation, began positioning Logan's refusal as evidence of inexperience, framing it as a reckless decision that would ultimately lead to failure. She doubled down on strengthening Forrester's own market presence, pushing her team harder than ever to produce collections that could overshadow Logan's rising influence. Yet beneath her determination, there was an undercurrent of urgency, an awareness that this was no longer a one-sided competition. Tensions escalated further when rumors began circulating about internal disagreements within Logan. It started subtly, whispers that Daphne Rose was pushing for more aggressive expansion strategies, that Carter Walton was growing concerned about financial sustainability, that creative differences between Hope and Zen were beginning to surface. None of it was entirely untrue, but none of it told the full story either. Like any growing company, Logan was navigating its own internal complexities, learning how to balance differing perspectives without losing cohesion. Daphne, in particular, found herself at the center of this narrative. Her past continued to follow her, casting doubt on her intentions even as she worked tirelessly to prove her loyalty. There were moments when her ambition clashed with Hope's more measured approach, when her desire to capitalize on momentum pushed against the boundaries Hope had set. And while those moments often led to productive discussions, they also created friction that could not be ignored. For Daphne, the challenge was not just about contributing to Logan's success, but about redefining how she was perceived by the team, by the industry, and perhaps most importantly by herself. Meanwhile, Katie Logan began to uncover something that added an entirely new layer of complexity to the situation. Through her media connections, she learned that certain negative stories about Logan weren't emerging organically. They were being strategically planted. The timing, the language, the subtle patterns all pointed to a coordinated effort to undermine the company's credibility. While there was no direct proof, the implications were clear enough. Someone somewhere saw Logan as enough of a threat to actively try to bring it down. When Katie brought this information to the team, the mood shifted instantly. What had once felt like a competitive landscape now carried the weight of something more calculated, more deliberate. Carter immediately began exploring legal avenues, looking for ways to protect the company from defamation and unfair practices. Zend, frustrated by the idea that their work could be overshadowed by manipulation, poured his energy into creating designs that would speak louder than any rumor. Daphne, drawing on her understanding of how influence operated behind the scenes, offered insights into how such campaigns were typically executed and how they might be countered. Hope, however, remained focused on what she believed mattered most. She refused to let fear dictate their direction, insisting that their response should be rooted in integrity rather than retaliation. They would address the rumors, yes, but they would do so by continuing to deliver quality, authenticity, and consistency. It was a strategy that required patience, something not easily maintained in an environment that often rewarded immediate action. But it was also a strategy that aligned with everything Logan stood for. As the pressure mounted, the bond between the four who had chosen to follow Hope was tested in ways none of them had fully anticipated. There were disagreements, moments of doubt, instances where the path forward seemed anything but clear. Yet through it all there remained a shared understanding, a recognition that what they were building was worth fighting for, even when the fight became difficult.